The desert night carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the crackling of the campfires and the haunting rhythm of drums. Evelyn Montgomery sat rigid on the back of a painted horse, her wrists bound loosely with leather thongs. Her dress, once a fine pale blue silk that had marked her as a woman of wealth and refinement, was now dusty and torn from the ambush earlier that day. She could still hear the gunfire echoing in her memory, the screams of the stagecoach passengers, and the thundering hooves of the Apache warriors who had descended upon them like spirits of the wilderness. She had been spared, not out of mercy, but because she was valuable. Now she was being led deeper into their world, a world that terrified her. Torches cast long shadows across the circle of lodges as the Apache camp came alive. Children ran barefoot across the sand, women stirred pots of stew, and men sat sharpening their weapons. Yet all eyes turned toward Evelyn as she was brought into the center. She felt like an animal on display, stripped of dignity and stripped of choice. She had heard stories of Apache cruelty all her life, stories of raids, of women stolen, of men slain without mercy. Her father, a railroad investor and land baron, had always warned her that the tribes were savages who despised the encroachment of civilization. And now here she was, living proof of his warnings, the daughter of a powerful man reduced to a prize of war. But there was something strange in the way the people regarded her. Some watched with open hostility, others with indifference. A few of the women whispered to one another, glancing between Evelyn and the tall warrior standing apart from the crowd. That warrior was Koa. Even before she had been thrust from the stagecoach and dragged into the desert, Evelyn had heard his name whispered by settlers and scouts alike. Koa, the Silent One. Koa, whose skill with the bow was said to be unmatched, whose ferocity in battle had earned him both fear and respect. He was young, but already legends grew around him. And now she was told she was to be his wife. The thought curdled her blood. As the camp feasted in celebration of their victory, Evelyn was pushed toward him. Her breath caught when she saw him up close. He was taller than most, his frame broad and powerful, his dark hair bound loosely at his shoulders. His face bore the sharp lines of both nobility and ruthlessness, though his expression gave nothing away. His eyes, however deep, steady, unreadable, met hers with a force that sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to scream, to demand her release, but the words died in her throat. Something about his gaze made her chest tighten, not only with fear but with something she could not yet name. The drums grew louder, echoing in her bones. She understood, even without translation, that the night was to end with her inside his lodge, his to claim. Panic clawed at her insides. She had been raised to be genteel, to sip tea and play piano, to one day marry a man of her father's choosing, a banker, a politician, someone respectable. Not this. Not him. As the fire burned lower and the people drifted to their lodges, Koa placed a firm but not cruel hand on her arm, guiding her toward the doorway of a hide-covered shelter. Evelyn's knees trembled. Every tale she had heard of savagery threatened to come alive in her imagination. Her mind raced with images of violence, of helpless surrender. Yet when she entered the dimly lit lodge and he closed the flap behind them, she felt a silence fall over her like a heavy blanket. The flickering light of the small fire within cast shadows across his face as he regarded her. She braced herself for force, for brutality. Instead, he simply stood there, studying her as though weighing something greater than possession. It was in that moment that Evelyn realized the night ahead might not unfold the way her fears had promised. Inside the lodge, Evelyn's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The leather walls kept out most of the night air, making the space feel warmer, closer, as if the fire itself pressed against her skin. Shadows danced across the hide coverings, twisting into shapes that made her imagination run wild. She stood frozen, every muscle taut, waiting for the inevitable moment when Koa would claim what the tribe had promised him. But the warrior did not move toward her. He crouched by the fire instead, feeding it a dry branch, the sparks snapping upward. His movements were deliberate, calm, so unlike the violent storm with which he and his men had taken her hours ago. Evelyn's throat tightened as she struggled to understand. Why wasn't he advancing? Why wasn't he tearing at her clothes as her fear had convinced her he would? When at last he turned, the firelight carved his face into bronze and shadow. His eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, yet strangely gentle. She wanted to look away, but his gaze anchored her in place. Her breath caught when he rose and approached, his steps quiet against the earth. Evelyn's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Don't," she whispered, though her voice trembled, betraying her desperation. He stopped only a few feet away. His chest rose and fell, powerful and controlled. Yet she noticed a flicker of hesitation, an almost imperceptible pause before he spoke. In halting, careful English, his voice low and husky, he said, "I'll be gentle." The words fell over her like cool water on fevered skin. She blinked, hardly believing what she had heard. Gentle? She had expected violence, cruelty, the fulfillment of every terrible warning her father had given her about the Apache. Instead, the man before her had whispered something that disarmed her completely. Evelyn's knees weakened, though not from terror alone. The tension inside her shifted, tangled into confusion. Was this some trick to lower her defenses? Or did he truly mean what he said? Koa moved no closer. He simply lowered himself to sit by the fire, his posture relaxed, as though telling her without words that she was safe for the moment. Evelyn's chest ached with the force of her uneven breaths. She wrapped her arms around herself and lowered slowly to the furs on the opposite side of the lodge for several minutes. Silence filled the space, broken only by the crackle of flames. Evelyn's eyes darted toward him, watching how the fire painted golden light over his skin, how the shadows carved strength into every line of his frame. His hands, broad, scarred, capable of such destruction, rested loosely on his knees. She noticed, with a pang of surprise, that when they shifted slightly, there was the faintest tremor. Was he nervous? The thought unsettled her. Men like Koa weren't supposed to feel hesitation. Yet here he was, holding himself back when he had all the power to take what he wanted. When she finally found her voice, it was hoarse. "Why me?" she asked, though she wasn't sure he would understand. Koa's dark eyes lifted to hers. For a long moment he said nothing, as though weighing the value of words themselves. Then he touched his chest with his hand and said, softly, Koa, his name. A gift of identity, an introduction between equals rather than conqueror and captive. Evelyn hesitated, then mirrored him. Her trembling fingers pressed against her collarbone. Evelyn. His lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but close enough to stir something unexpected in her chest. The fire between them burned low, yet the air in the lodge felt warmer, heavier. Her fear had not vanished, it still clung to her, sharp and relentless, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. Something else pressed against it, hot and unfamiliar, a strange awareness of the man who sat across from her. Watching with eyes that saw too much. When exhaustion finally tugged at her, she lay down on the furs, turned slightly away from him. Every nerve in her body remained alert, braced for his touch. But none came. As her eyelids drifted shut, Evelyn realized her terror had shifted into something more dangerous. Curiosity. And beneath that curiosity, though she fought to smother it, a flicker of desire sparked to life. The days that followed blurred into one another, a strange rhythm of survival Evelyn had never imagined herself enduring. Each dawn she woke inside Koa's lodge, her body stiff from the hard furs, her ears filled with the sounds of camp life beyond the hide walls, children laughing, dogs barking, women calling to one another as they began the morning's work. It was a world that moved without pause, and though she had always lived among servants and silks, here she was expected to fend for herself. At first, Evelyn resisted. She refused the food offered to her, pushing away the bowls of stew brought by curious women who peered into Koa's lodge. She turned her face when roasted corn or dried meat was placed near her hands, choosing hunger over the humiliation of dependence. Each refusal was her way of clinging to the scraps of dignity left to her, the only rebellion she could manage in captivity. But pride was a fragile thing against the gnawing of an empty stomach. By the second day her head swam with dizziness, her body weak. She could not ignore the pangs much longer. It was then that Koa appeared, stepping into the lodge with quiet authority. In his hands he carried a wooden bowl, steam rising from it. He knelt before her, close enough that she caught the earthy scent of smoke and leather clinging to him. Without a word, he placed the bowl between them. The stew was simple beans, venison, wild herbs, but to her starving senses it smelled like heaven itself. Evelyn's lips parted, though pride warred with need. She looked up at him, expecting a mocking grin, some flash of triumph at her weakness. Instead, his face remained unreadable, his eyes calm, as though he were waiting, not demanding. Her hand trembled as she finally lifted the bowl. Koa said nothing, only watched as she ate, each spoonful restoring strength to her limbs. Shame burned in her chest, yet alongside it came a flicker of gratitude she refused to voice. After that, he made it a quiet ritual. Each evening, he brought food. Sometimes meat cooked over the fire, sometimes fresh fruit gathered from the brush, sometimes flatbread wrapped in cloth. Always he set it before her without comment, as though it were not the act of a captor but of a man offering courtship. The more she observed him, the less he fit the image of savage monster she had carried from her father's stories. Koa was not loud or boastful like some of the younger warriors. He spoke little, but his silence held weight. In camp he moved with ease among his people, respected, unchallenged. Yet when his gaze settled on her, there was a gentleness she could not reconcile with the legend of his ferocity. One night, Evelyn sat near the fire pit inside the lodge, combing her fingers through her tangled hair. The flames painted her in shifting light, her gown now reduced to little more than rags. She felt his presence before she heard him. Koa entering quietly, his shadow stretching long across the ground. When he passed her, she expected him to ignore her as usual. Instead, he stopped. His hand, roughened by years of battle, reached out and brushed against her hair. The gesture was so fleeting she almost doubted it happened. Yet it left a trail of heat across her scalp, sending shivers down her spine. Evelyn's breath caught. She should have recoiled, should have reminded herself that this was her captor. But instead, she sat frozen, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. That night, when she lay down to sleep, her thoughts refused to quiet. She remembered the light touch of his hand, the way his fingers trembled ever so slightly. She wondered if he felt the same strange fire that now smoldered in her chest. It frightened her more than anything else that desire could live alongside fear, that her body could betray her mind so completely. And as the firelight faded, Evelyn understood with dawning dread that something inside her was changing. Something she could no longer deny. By the fourth night in the Apache camp, Evelyn's awareness of her surroundings had sharpened. She no longer felt like a stranger walking among shadows, though fear still lingered in her chest. The women eyed her with curiosity but kept their distance, whispering among themselves. The children stared openly, some with innocent fascination, others with mistrust inherited from their elders. But it was the men, the warriors, that unsettled her most. Their glances were not kind. To them, she was a symbol of a feud older than herself, a reminder of the encroaching world beyond the desert. She could feel the weight of their resentment pressing down on her whenever she stepped outside Koa's lodge. Though no one laid a hand on her, The hostility in their eyes told her she was tolerated, not welcomed out. One evening, as twilight settled over the camp, Evelyn found herself returning from the water stream with a clay jug in her hands. The setting sun painted the horizon in streaks of red and gold, but its beauty was lost on her. Every step she took back toward the camp made her chest tighten. She felt the gazes of warriors gathered near the fires, their low voices carrying a mocking edge she couldn't understand but instinctively recognized. Then one of them stepped forward. He was tall and broad, his hair bound in braids adorned with feathers. His eyes gleamed with something darker than curiosity, bitterness. Evelyn froze as he drew closer, blocking her path. Though she couldn't understand his words, the sneer on his lips needed no translation. He gestured toward Koa's lodge, then at her, laughing harshly. The meaning was clear. She belonged only because Koa had claimed her. Without Koa, she would be prey. Her hands trembled around the jug, water sloshing dangerously. Panic clawed at her throat. She wanted to turn, to run, but her feet refused to move. The warrior leaned closer, his voice a low taunt that made her skin crawl. She didn't know if he intended to frighten her or if his threats hinted at something worse, but terror surged through her veins all the same. Before she could cry out, another presence filled the space. Koa. He stepped between them with the silent, lethal grace of a predator. His shoulders squared, his stance commanding. The mocking warrior's laughter died instantly. They exchanged words sharp as flint, the tension between them thick and dangerous. Evelyn didn't need to know the language to understand. This was a warning, a claim, and a promise of consequence should the line be crossed again. Rival sneered one last time before retreating into the shadows, his pride wounded but his threat unforgotten. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled with relief. Koa turned to her, his gaze searching her face. His hand brushed the jug she still clutched, steadying it before it slipped from her trembling fingers. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with surprising gentleness, he guided her back toward his lodge, his hand firm on her arm. Inside, the safety of the dimly lit shelter wrapped around her. Yet Evelyn could not shake the memory of that cruel sneer, the reminder of how vulnerable she truly was. When she sat down by the fire, she realized she was shaking, not just from fear of the rival warrior, but from the stark understanding that Koa's protection was the only barrier between her and danger. She looked at him differently then. He was no longer only her captor, but her shield. That night when she lay down on the furs, she felt the weight of his presence beside her. Not close enough to touch, yet near enough that she sensed his watchfulness, his silent promise to guard her. For the first time, she did not feel entirely alone, and for the first time, her fear of the others outweighed her fear of him. The days stretched into weeks, and Evelyn began to notice subtle changes in herself she could hardly name. The fear that had gripped her so tightly in the first nights of captivity was no longer her constant companion. It lingered, yes, but alongside it was something far more dangerous, a quiet curiosity about the man she had been forced to live with, a fascination that refused to be denied. Evelyn had begun to participate in the life of the camp, tentatively at first. She helped the women with chores, learning how to grind corn into meal and how to tend small fires for cooking. Her hands, once accustomed to fine fabrics and delicate embroidery, became calloused from work, yet there was a satisfaction in the labor, a strange sense of belonging she could not have imagined. The women still whispered, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with approval, but she no longer cared. It was Koa who observed her transformation most closely. His eyes, dark and unreadable, would follow her movements as she carried water or tended the small garden behind the lodge. Though he spoke little, his presence was constant, reassuring, and powerful. She began to notice the smallest gestures, a hand steadying her when she tripped, a nod of approval when she completed a task with care. They were gestures that might have seemed minor to another, but to Evelyn they were profound, and they stirred something in her chest that made it impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Evelyn injured her hand while preparing food. A knife had slipped, leaving a shallow cut that bled easily in the dry desert air. Panic rose in her chest, but Koa was there before she could cry out. He gently took her hand, examining it with meticulous care. His fingers were strong and capable, yet there was an unmistakable gentleness in the way he cleaned the wound and wrapped it in soft cloth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The words felt inadequate for the flood of emotions rising within her. Koa said nothing, only met her gaze briefly before turning away. Yet the moment lingered. Evelyn realized that he had not once spoken of his claim over her, nor had he suggested ownership. His care was given freely, without expectation, and it unsettled her more than any threat or harsh word ever could. Night after night, as she lay upon the furs, Evelyn found herself thinking of him. She remembered the way his hand had brushed hers, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, the way he moved through the camp with a strength that was both commanding and restrained. A dangerous fascination took root, one that she tried to smother beneath layers of pride and self-preservation, yet it refused to die. Her thoughts drifted further when she saw him laugh quietly with the children, his stern mask softening in their presence. She wondered what it would be like to be on the receiving end of that rare warmth, to know the man behind the warrior, to glimpse the soul that had chosen to protect rather than harm her. And yet, every time desire stirred, fear was not far behind. She reminded herself that he could still be a captor, that her old life still existed somewhere far beyond the desert, that the world she knew might call her back. But the fear began to feel smaller, less consuming. One evening, as she prepared water for the lodge, Koa appeared behind her, his presence almost silent. He did not touch her, did not speak, and yet she felt a shiver of awareness ripple through her. Something had shifted. She was no longer a prisoner merely waiting for the dawn. She was a woman beginning to recognize the quiet power of care, of protection, and of a connection that defied fear. Her heart, long armored by terror and pride, had begun to crack, and in those cracks, she sensed the first fragile tendrils of something that could become love. The desert air was sharp that night, carrying the distant sound of drums and the occasional cry of an animal echoing through the camp. Evelyn had grown accustomed to the rhythms of life within the Apache village, yet nothing could prepare her for the sudden eruption of chaos that tore through the night. The alarm came as a low, tense murmur at first. Shouts rang out from the outskirts of the camp, and warriors sprang into action, weapons in hand. A rival tribe had found their location, and their attack was swift and merciless. Fires blazed in several lodges, and the screams of men, women, and children mixed with the crackle of flame and the staccato of arrows striking shields. Evelyn's heart pounded violently against her ribcage, and for the first time in weeks, fear coursed through her veins with raw intensity. She grabbed a jug of water, intending to help, but froze when she saw a group of intruders moving toward the lodge. Her instincts screamed to run, but some deeper, unreasoning part of her urged her to stay. She had seen Koa in the courtyard moments before, meeting the attackers head-on with a lethal calm, his bow singing with deadly precision. The sight both terrified and mesmerized her. Without thinking, Evelyn ran toward him, her small figure weaving through the chaos. She had no weapon, no training, nothing but a desperate will to be near the man who had claimed a quiet, inexplicable place in her heart. And then she saw an arrow streak toward him, an arrow that could have ended everything. In a blur, Koa twisted, grabbing her in his powerful arms and shielding her with his body. The force of his protection knocked her off balance, but she clung to him, her breath catching as she realized how fragile a life could be, and how quickly everything could change. When the battle subsided and the attackers were repelled, The camp slowly returned to a tense, uneasy calm. Evelyn sank to the ground, her knees shaking, her hands trembling from the adrenaline. Koa knelt beside her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. She looked up at him, and for the first time, fear intertwined with something far deeper, gratitude, relief, and a longing that she could no longer ignore. The fire from the lodge's hearth cast flickering shadows across his strong features, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the intense focus of his dark eyes. Evelyn's chest heaved, not from fear this time, but from a rush of desire she had fought so hard to suppress. Unable to contain herself, she leaned forward. Her lips brushed his, soft at first, tentative, as though testing the waters of a dangerous but irresistible current. Koa's eyes widened for the briefest instant, then softened. He leaned into her, meeting her kiss with a tenderness that belied the strength he had just displayed in battle. The kiss deepened, becoming a wildfire of emotion and heat. It was fierce, consuming, and relentless, carrying with it weeks of suppressed longing, fear, and curiosity. Every touch of his hands, every press of his lips, ignited a fire that Evelyn could no longer resist. She felt her walls crumble as passion replaced fear, heat replacing icy tension, until the world beyond the lodge, the attacks, the dangers, the expectations faded to nothing. For the first time, Evelyn realized she was no longer simply a captive, no longer a frightened girl in a strange land. In Koa's arms, she felt alive in ways she had never imagined, every nerve afire, every heartbeat synchronized with his. The warrior who had once been a figure of dread had become the center of her world, a man who could destroy her or save her, and yet chose tenderness over cruelty. As they finally pulled apart, breathless and flushed, Evelyn rested her head against his chest. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, a steady pulse that matched the intensity of her own. Fear had not vanished entirely, but it had been eclipsed by something far stronger: desire, connection, and the undeniable spark of love that had been smoldering quietly all along. That night, beneath the stars and the dying embers of fire, Evelyn understood one truth with piercing clarity: passion, once awakened, burned hotter than fear ever could. The sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the horizon with muted shades of gold and crimson. Evelyn awoke in the quiet calm of Koa's lodge, her body still warm from the closeness of the night before. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting soft shadows that danced across the walls. She lay on her side, watching him sleep, the rise and fall of his chest steady and comforting. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging she could not have imagined when she had first been thrust into this wild and unfamiliar world. Even in the midst of this newfound intimacy, a whisper of reality tugged at her mind. Word had reached the camp. Soldiers were searching for her, sent by her father, determined to retrieve the daughter he believed had been taken unjustly. The thought of returning to the life she had once known stirred a mixture of dread and longing in her chest. Her family, her home, her name all called to her from a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Koa noticed the shadow in her expression as he poured water for the morning. His dark eyes met hers, calm and steady, as if he could see every conflict raging within her. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You are free," he said in English, halting but deliberate. "If you wish to leave, I will not stop you." The words hit her like a blow. Freedom, a gift, yet a test. She wanted desperately to flee to the safety of her old life, yet the thought of leaving him, of abandoning the man who had become her protector, her confidant, the source of the first passion she had ever felt, made her chest tighten. Her mind reeled with the impossible choice before her: duty or desire, family or love, the world she knew or the world that had become her own. Over the next hours, Evelyn wandered through the camp, the familiar sights now tinged with a bittersweet quality. Children ran and played, unaware of the turmoil swirling within her. Women worked in the communal areas, their gazes warm yet wary. Koa moved silently among them, commanding respect without demanding it, his every gesture measured and purposeful. She realized then that he had built a world here, a world of order and loyalty, of trust and protection, a world in which she had begun to feel truly alive. The soldiers arrived that afternoon, their horses stirring up clouds of dust as they approached the camp. Evelyn's heart pounded, a mix of fear and anticipation. She stood at the edge of the encampment, Koa beside her, his hand brushing hers lightly, a grounding presence in the storm of uncertainty. The officers dismounted, their eyes scanning the camp with authority and suspicion. One of them, a young man with sharp features, called out her name. Evelyn felt the pull of her old life, the lure of home and safety, yet something deeper held her in place. She looked at Koa, seeing not only the man who had saved her life, but the man who had captured her heart. She knew, in that moment, that leaving would mean surrendering everything she had come to feel, the care, the intimacy, the fierce passion that had awakened within her. The thought of returning to a life devoid of his presence, a life of expectations and etiquette, suddenly seemed unbearable. With a deep, steadying breath, Evelyn made her choice. She stepped forward, closer to Koa, and pressed her hand into his. Her gaze met his, filled with conviction, desire, and the beginnings of a profound love. "I stay," she whispered, her voice trembling yet resolute. Koa's eyes darkened with a mixture of relief and tenderness. He drew her close, and for the first time, their lips met in a kiss that was not born of fear or uncertainty, but of mutual choice and passion. The world beyond the camp, the soldiers, her family, her old life faded into irrelevance. In that moment, Evelyn understood fully that the life she had chosen was not one of captivity, but of freedom, the freedom to love, to desire, and to live on her own terms. With Koa by her side, the sun had barely risen, spilling pale gold across the desert when the soldiers arrived at the Apache camp. Their horses' hooves kicked up clouds of dust, and the sound of commands and the clinking of metal pierced the early morning calm. Evelyn stood at the edge of the encampment, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and an unexpected certainty. She had made her choice the night before, yet now, confronted with the reality of leaving or staying, her courage would be tested in ways she had never imagined. The leader of the soldiers dismounted, his sharp eyes scanning the camp. When they rested on Evelyn, he called her name, loud and commanding, expecting obedience. The world she had once known, the life of silk, of expectation, of her father's protection, stretched out before her like a familiar path. It was safe, predictable, and proper. And yet, her hand instinctively went to Koa's, finding warmth, strength, and a tether to the life she had chosen. For a moment, doubt flickered like a shadow in her chest. She glanced at Koa, whose dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made the decision clear. He had told her she was free to go, yet in his silence was the unspoken hope, the trust that she would choose not out of fear, but from her heart. Evelyn understood that he did not demand her stay, did not coerce her with threats or the weight of his power. The choice was hers alone, and it carried with it the full weight of consequence. As the soldiers approached, Koa shifted slightly, a subtle protective gesture, his presence a shield against any harm. Evelyn's fingers tightened around his. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm, strong and unwavering, a force that had come to define safety and desire in her life. Fear was still there, whispering reminders of danger and uncertainty, but it had been eclipsed by something far more potent, love and passion, fierce and undeniable. With a decisive breath, Evelyn stepped forward, placing herself beside Koa, not behind him, not as a frightened girl, but as a woman who had made her choice with full awareness of its weight. She turned to the soldiers, meeting their gaze with unwavering resolve. The world they represented, the world of her past, could no longer claim her. She belonged here, in the desert, in this camp, with the man who had awakened a fire within her stronger than fear. The soldiers, recognizing the determination in her eyes and the silent warning in Koa's stance, fell silent. The leader, though accustomed to obedience, could see that this was not a decision made lightly. Evelyn's choice had shifted the power in subtle but irreversible ways. She had stepped out of fear and into love, and nothing the soldiers could say or do would undo that. Turning back to Koa, Evelyn saw the faintest trace of a smile on his lips, a shadow of relief, pride, and something softer tenderness reserved only for her. Without hesitation, she pressed herself against him, her lips brushing his in a kiss that spoke of passion, commitment, and the triumph of desire over fear. His arms enveloped her, holding her close as though the world beyond the camp no longer existed. The fire that had been quietly burning between them for weeks now roared into flame. Every touch, every brush of skin, every heartbeat was a declaration that love could exist in the harshest of places, that passion could conquer fear, that the heart could choose its own path, no matter the expectations of society, family, or circumstance. Evelyn rested her head against Koa's chest, breathing in the steady rhythm of his life, feeling the pulse of his strength and the heat of his passion. She was no longer a captive. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman who had chosen love in its fullest, fiercest form, and it burned brighter than any fear she had ever known. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the camp in warm light, Evelyn and Koa remained wrapped in each other's arms, a testament to the power of choice, desire, and love that refused to be tamed. The world could wait. Here, in this moment, passion had triumphed, and it would never be extinguished.